March 3rd, 1989. A 5-year-old boy eats his favorite cinnamon cereal, grabs his backpack, and walks toward the school bus stop, a path he's taken countless times before. But this time, he never makes it. Within hours, his small community in South Carolina erupts into frantic searches. Hundreds comb through woods, ponds, and homes. Then, 2 days later, his own father makes a discovery that shatters everything. The boy's body, hidden inside a camper on their property, a camper that had already been searched multiple times. What followed was 35 years of accusations, failed polygraphs, a dismissed murder charge, and a family torn apart by suspicion. Today, we're diving deep into one of South Carolina's most haunting cold cases, the murder of Justin Lee Turner. A case where everyone thinks they know who did it, but proving it became impossible. Before we go any further, help us bring attention to Justin's story by hitting that like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dive investigations into cases that demand answers. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what detail stands out to you most? Let's get into it. Rural South Carolina in 1989 was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where kids walked to the bus stop without a second thought, and where the biggest worry on a Friday morning was whether you'd remembered your homework. Berkeley County, near the small town of Moncks Corner, was quiet, peaceful, even. The kind of place where nothing bad ever really happened. Until March 3rd, 1989. That morning started like any other for 5-year-old Justin Lee Turner. Picture this, a blonde, blue-eyed kindergartner with a shy smile, sitting at the kitchen table eating his favorite cereal, cinnamon-flavored, the kind that turned the milk sweet and sugary. He was getting ready for school, probably chattering about whatever 5-year-olds talk about, maybe his friends, maybe the weekend coming up. It was Friday, after all. Just one more day until he could play all he wanted. Justin lived in a modest home on Horseshoe Road with his father, Victor Turner, and his stepmother, Pamela Turner. The house sat in a wooded, rural area south of Cross, the kind of property where pine trees stretched tall and dirt roads wound through the landscape. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. And for Justin, home meant a routine he knew by heart. Every school day, Justin would finish breakfast, grab his things, and walk down the dirt road to a neighbor's house. That's where the school bus stopped to pick up the local kids. It wasn't far, just a short walk, maybe a few hundred yards at most. Justin had done it countless times. His best friend, another boy named Justin who lived nearby, would usually meet him there. They'd wait together, two little boys heading off to Whitesville Elementary School, where they were classmates in kindergarten. But that Friday morning, something went terribly, inexplicably wrong. Justin never made it to the neighbor's driveway. Somewhere along that short, familiar path between his front door and the bus stop, he vanished. No screams, no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, just gone. When the school bus pulled up to Whitesville Elementary that morning, Justin wasn't on it. At first, nobody panicked. Kids miss the bus sometimes, right? Maybe he was sick. Maybe his parents kept him home for the day. His kindergarten classmates noticed he wasn't there, but they assumed he was home with a cold or something. No big deal. But as the morning turned into afternoon, and afternoon stretched toward evening, something became clear. Justin wasn't homesick. Nobody knew where he was. The neighbor's grandson, Justin's best friend and bus buddy, later remembered waiting for Justin that morning. He stood at his grandmother's house, expecting his friend to come walking down the road like he always did. But Justin never showed up. The boy figured maybe Justin was staying home that day. He got on the bus without him and went to school. It wasn't until later that afternoon, around 4:30 or 5 p.m., that things took a darker turn. Justin's stepmother, Pamela Turner, came around to the neighbor's house asking if anyone had seen Justin. She was looking for him. The neighbor's grandson told her what he knew. Justin hadn't been on the bus that morning. He'd assumed Justin was homesick. That's when the gravity of the situation hit everyone like a freight train. Justin wasn't at school. He wasn't at home. Nobody had seen him all day. He was missing. Pamela Turner immediately called 911. Can you imagine that moment? The sudden, cold realization that a 5-year-old child, your child, is nowhere to be found? The panic must have been overwhelming. Within minutes, the peaceful routine of this rural neighborhood shattered into 1,000 pieces. Something was very, very wrong. Berkeley County Sheriff's deputies James Gaither and Philip Mason responded to the call. It was early evening on March 3rd when they arrived at the Turner property. By then, The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the woods around Horseshoe Road were beginning to fill with shadows. Tom was critical. A missing 5-year-old in a rural area surrounded by dense forest, ponds, and miles of open land? Every minute mattered. The search kicked off immediately. Family members, neighbors, and law enforcement officers fanned out across the Turner property and the surrounding area. They called Justin's name over and over, their voices echoing through the trees. Flashlights cut through the gathering dusk as worry mounted with each passing hour. Where could he be? Had he wandered off into the woods and gotten lost? Had he fallen into one of the nearby ponds? Or, and this was the thought nobody wanted to voice out loud, had someone taken him? In those first frantic hours, the search was exhaustive. Deputies and volunteers left no stone unturned. They searched the Turner's house from top to bottom, under beds, in closets, even in the attic. They checked the yard, the outbuildings, the vehicles parked on the property. They even crawled beneath the house, hoping against hope that Justin had somehow gotten stuck or hidden himself in some small space. They combed the dense pine forests nearby in a grid pattern, methodically covering every inch of ground. They dredged ponds, terrified that the little boy might have fallen in and drowned. Tracking dogs and rescue teams were brought in as darkness fell, adding urgency to an already desperate situation. Friends and family desperately tried to recall if Justin had ever wandered off before. He hadn't. Not once. Justin wasn't the type of kid to run away or disappear. He was a sweet, amiable 5-year-old who loved school and his friends. There was no reason he would just vanish. But here's what made it even more unsettling. Nobody saw anything unusual that morning. In this tight-knit community where everyone knew each other, where neighbors looked out for one another, not a single person reported spotting any strangers. Nobody heard any disturbances. No unfamiliar cars. No suspicious activity. Nothing. It was as if Justin had vanished into thin air. By the next day, Saturday, March 4th, the search effort had exploded in size. Over 100 people joined the hunt for the missing boy. Berkeley County Sheriff's deputies, local police, firefighters, and civilian volunteers. Everyone came together to find Justin. Search and rescue units scoured a widening radius around the Turner property, moving through fields, forests, and roadways. Neighbors kept their eyes peeled and their doors unlocked, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the little boy would wander up to one of their houses looking for help. But Justin was nowhere to be found. Fear gripped the community of Monk's Corner. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Parents who had once let their children play freely in the front yards now kept them indoors. One worried grandfather in the neighborhood was so shaken that he refused to let his young grandson play in the front yard anymore. The child could only play in the fenced backyard, under watchful eyes. The very idea that a child could disappear in broad daylight on a quiet country road left everyone on edge. Rumors started swirling almost immediately. Had Justin run away? Unlikely. He was only 5 and had never wandered before. Was it a custody kidnapping? Justin's parents had gone through a bitter divorce, and his biological mother had desperately wanted more custody. Could she have taken him? Or, worst of all, had a predator snatched him off the road? That possibility made everyone shudder. It implied that some sinister stranger could be lurking in their midst, someone who had been watching, waiting. As searchers pressed on into a second night with no trace of Justin, the case increasingly looked like an abduction. Berkeley County Sheriff's Captain Sidney Runn, who would become one of the lead investigators, later remarked how dozens of investigators were on the property all weekend long without finding the boy. That raised a troubling question that nobody wanted to ask out loud. If Justin was somewhere on the property to be found, how had everyone missed him? And if he truly wasn't there, then where was he? Had someone taken him far away? Justin's family grew more frantic with each passing hour. His maternal relatives, in particular, were distraught. Justin's biological mother, Vivian Elaine Pace, often called just Elaine, didn't have primary custody of her son. She and Victor Turner had gone through a difficult divorce years earlier, and Victor had won custody, much to Elaine's heartbreak. But she remained a devoted mother, maintaining frequent phone calls and weekend visits with Justin. She loved him fiercely. When the call came in on Friday afternoon that Justin hadn't gotten off the school bus, Elaine's world collapsed. Justin's maternal grandfather was actually the first in the family to hear the news. He immediately called other family members, and they all rushed to Monk's Corner to support the search efforts. They were terrified, but they held on to hope. Maybe Justin had just gotten lost. Maybe he was hiding somewhere, scared and alone, waiting to be found. After 2 agonizing days of searching, 2 days of calling his name, combing through forests, dragging ponds, checking every possible hiding spot, the tense atmosphere finally broke. But not in the way anyone had hoped. On Sunday morning, March 5, 1989, Justin's father, Victor Turner, was combing through the family's property yet again alongside investigators. By this point, the same areas had been searched multiple times. Everyone was exhausted, emotionally drained, running on fumes and sheer determination. Victor approached a travel camper that was parked on the Turners' own land. This camper had been checked before, multiple times, according to reports. But for some reason, Victor decided to look again. He pulled open a cabinet door inside the camper. And then he shouted, "Here he is! Here he is!" Other searchers nearby heard Victor's panicked voice and rushed over. One of the men cried out, "Something's in there. Everybody, stand back." Inside a built-in storage compartment of the camper, curled up and hidden away, lay the small, lifeless body of Justin Lee Turner. The scene that unfolded was every parent's nightmare. Justin's body was tucked inside the camper's cabinet, as if someone had hastily hidden him there. Victor Turner had found his own missing son, but it was far from a joyous discovery. The little boy was clearly deceased. As people crowded around in shock and disbelief, Victor and the others were quickly ushered away. The area was immediately taped off as a crime scene. Some searchers broke down in tears. The surrounding community, which had prayed and hoped and searched tirelessly for 2 days, was absolutely devastated. The bright, friendly child they'd all been looking for had been found dead, right under their noses, hidden on the very property where they'd been searching all along. But the horror didn't end there. Because as investigators began to process the scene, disturbing details started to emerge. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This wasn't a case of a little boy wandering off and getting hurt. This was murder, and the evidence suggested it was someone close to home. Let's rewind for a moment. Before that devastating discovery in the camper, before the crime scene tape and the tears, there were 2 full days of desperate searching. 2 days where an entire community came together, united by one single goal: find Justin Turner and bring him home safely. The search effort that unfolded across Berkeley County was nothing short of extraordinary. When word spread that a 5-year-old boy had vanished, people dropped everything. Neighbors who barely knew the Turner family showed up. Strangers drove in from nearby towns. Everyone wanted to help. Because when a child goes missing, it stops being about who you know or don't know. It becomes about doing whatever you can to bring that child home. By Saturday morning, March 4th, the scene around Horseshoe Road had transformed into a full-scale search operation. Over 100 people gathered at the Turner property, ready to fan out across the rural landscape. Berkeley County Sheriff's deputies coordinated with local police, firefighters, and civilian volunteers. Search and rescue units brought in specialized equipment. The energy was intense, focused, determined. But underneath all that determination was a growing sense of dread. Because here's the thing about searches for missing children: the first 24 hours are critical. After that, the statistics get grimmer. Everyone involved knew this, even if nobody said it out loud. As Saturday morning turned into Saturday afternoon, and still no sign of Justin, that unspoken fear began to settle over everyone like a dark cloud. The search teams divided the area into grids, marking off sections to ensure no ground was left uncovered. They moved through dense pine forests, calling Justin's name constantly. "Justin, can you hear us? Justin." The woods would go silent for a moment after each call, everyone listening, hoping for a small voice to call back. But there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of search dogs barking. The terrain around the Turner property was challenging. Thick underbrush, muddy patches near the ponds, fallen logs and debris scattered throughout the forest. Searchers pushed through it all, checking behind every tree, looking under every bush, examining every possible hiding spot. Some areas were so dense that volunteers had to crawl on their hands and knees to see properly. The ponds were particularly concerning. South Carolina has no shortage of water: small ponds, drainage ditches, creeks. For a 5-year-old who might have wandered off the path, water presented a serious danger. Divers were brought in to check several ponds near the property. They dragged the murky water, searching for any sign of the little boy. Each time they came up empty, there was momentary relief, but also frustration. If Justin wasn't in the water, where was he? The tracking dogs worked tirelessly, sniffing clothing items that belonged to Justin to pick up his scent. They'd catch a trail, follow it for a bit, then lose it. The dogs would circle back, try again, move in different directions. But nothing led to Justin. It was as if his scent simply stopped, like he'd vanished into thin air right there on that dirt road. Inside the Turner home, investigators conducted thorough searches. They checked every room, every closet, every possible space where a small child could fit. Under beds, nothing. In the attic, nothing. The basement crawl space, nothing. They examined the outbuildings on the property, storage sheds, a garage, that travel camper parked near the house. Deputy Philip Mason, one of the first responders, later insisted he personally searched that camper on the first day. He looked inside, checked the obvious spots, found nothing out of place. Or so he thought. As the search continued, family members arrived from all over. Justin's maternal grandfather, devastated by the news, drove to Monk's Corner with other relatives. Justin's biological mother, Elaine Pace, was at work when she got the call. According to reports, she was absolutely frantic. When Berkeley County deputies contacted her asking if she knew where Justin was, her response was immediate and desperate. "I do not have my son. Will you please find my son?" Elaine rushed to join the search effort. She hadn't seen Justin in a few days. Her custody arrangement with Victor meant she only got him on weekends, but she spoke to him regularly on the phone. He was her baby, and the thought of him being out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly scared, was unbearable. She joined the other volunteers, walking through the woods, calling his name, praying for a miracle. The community response was remarkable. People who didn't even know the Turner family showed up with flashlights, water, food for the searchers. Local churches organized prayer vigils. News crews arrived, broadcasting updates and appeals for information. Justin's face, that sweet, innocent kindergarten photo with his blonde hair and blue eyes, appeared on television screens across South Carolina. Tips started coming in. Someone thought they saw a boy matching Justin's description at a gas station. Another caller reported a suspicious vehicle in the area. Each lead was followed up immediately, but none of them panned out. The boy at the gas station wasn't Justin. The suspicious vehicle belonged to a local resident who'd been there for legitimate reasons. As Saturday evening approached and the sun began to set again, the mood grew heavier. Searchers who'd been out all day were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Some took breaks, grabbed coffee, then went right back out. Nobody wanted to stop. Nobody wanted to be the one who gave up. The community of Monk's Corner was gripped by fear unlike anything they'd experienced before. This was a place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids rode bikes until dark, where the biggest concern was usually whether the crops were doing well or if the high school football team would win on Friday night. But now parents were terrified. One grandfather in the neighborhood captured the anxiety perfectly. He flat out refused to let his young grandson play in the front yard. The child was only allowed in the fenced backyard, and even then, under constant supervision. Other families did the same. Children who normally played outside until dinner time were kept indoors. Parents drove their kids to the bus stop instead of letting them walk. The sense of safety that had defined this rural community was shattered. Because if a 5-year-old could disappear in broad daylight on a quiet country road, a road he'd walked dozens of times, then what did that mean? Was there a predator lurking in the area? Had someone been watching, waiting for an opportunity? The thought was terrifying. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some people whispered that it had to be a stranger abduction, some drifter passing through who'd seen Justin walking alone and seized the opportunity. Others wondered if it was related to the custody battle between Victor and Elaine. Could Elaine, desperate to have her son back, have arranged for someone to take him? That theory didn't sit right with many people who knew Elaine. She was a devoted mother, but she wasn't unstable or dangerous. Then there were the darker whispers. What if it was someone in the family? What if something had happened inside the home, and this whole missing child scenario was a cover-up? Those whispers were quieter, spoken in hushed tones, because nobody wanted to believe that a parent or step-parent could harm their own child. But in missing persons cases, statistics tell a hard truth. When a child vanishes, investigators always look at the family first. Because statistically, that's where the answers usually are. As Sunday morning dawned on March 5th, The search entered its third day. Volunteers who'd been there since Friday were running on adrenaline and coffee. New volunteers arrived to help, but the mood had shifted. There was less hope now, more grim determination. After 2 full days of intensive searching, the likelihood of finding Justin alive was dwindling rapidly. Captain Sidney Runn, one of the lead investigators, later reflected on those first 2 days with frustration. Dozens of investigators had been on the property all weekend. Dozens. They'd searched every inch of that land, or so they believed. And yet, they'd found nothing. How was that possible? If Justin was on the property, why hadn't anyone found him? And if he wasn't on the property, where had he been taken? The questions hung heavy in the air as Victor Turner walked across his property yet again that Sunday morning. He was searching alongside investigators, retracing steps, checking places that had already been checked. Maybe they'd missed something. Maybe there was some small detail, some overlooked spot. Victor approached the travel camper. The same camper that had been searched before. The same camper where, according to Deputy Mason, nothing had been found. But this time, when Victor opened that cabinet door, everything changed. The discovery of Justin's body inside the camper raised immediate questions. Questions that would haunt this case for decades. How did everyone miss him during the initial searches? Multiple people claimed to have checked that camper. Deputy Mason insisted he'd looked through it. Justin's paternal grandmother said she'd checked it on day 2. A neighbor had peered inside as well. All of them swore the body wasn't there. So how did Justin end up in that cabinet? There were really only 2 possibilities, and both were chilling. Possibility 1. The initial searches weren't as thorough as everyone believed. Maybe in the chaos and panic of those first hours, people opened some doors, glanced around quickly, but didn't actually check every single compartment. Maybe that particular cabinet, tucked away and easy to overlook, was never properly opened. Possibility 2, and this was the one that sent shivers down everyone's spine, Justin's body had been moved. Maybe he wasn't in the camper during those first searches because someone had hidden him elsewhere. And then, once the intensive searching began to wind down, once the immediate area around the camper had been cleared and investigators had moved on to other sections of the property, someone snuck the body into that cabinet. If possibility 2 was true, it meant something horrifying. The person who killed Justin was likely right there during the search, watching, waiting, calculating when and where to hide the body so it would eventually be found, but not too soon. It meant the killer was someone with intimate knowledge of the search operation, someone who had access to the property, someone who could move around without raising suspicion. It meant the killer was probably family. As investigators secured the crime scene that Sunday morning, as Justin's small body was carefully removed from the camper, as family members collapsed in grief and shock, one thing became crystal clear. This case was about to take a very dark turn. The search for a missing boy was over. The hunt for a murderer was just beginning. Sunday morning, March 5, 1989. Imagine the scene for a moment. Exhausted searchers, many of whom hadn't slept in 2 days, were still combing through the Turner property. The initial wave of adrenaline that had fueled everyone through Friday and Saturday was long gone. Now it was just raw determination mixed with growing despair. Victor Turner had every reason to be devastated. His 5-year-old son had been missing for over 48 hours. As a father, the not knowing must have been torture. Where was Justin? Was he cold? Hungry? Scared? Or worse? And this was the thought that probably kept Victor awake at night. Was he already gone? So when Victor walked up to that travel camper on Sunday morning, nobody thought twice about it. He was a father searching for his son. He had every right to check and double-check every inch of his property. The camper had reportedly been searched before, but maybe, just maybe, there was something everyone had missed. Victor reached for one of the cabinet doors inside the camper. The kind of built-in storage compartment that travel campers have for dishes, supplies, whatever you need to store away. He pulled it open. And that's when everything changed. Here he is. Here he is. Victor's shouts pierced the morning air. Other searchers nearby, investigators, volunteers, family members, heard the panic in his voice and came running. One of them yelled, "Something's in there. Everybody, stand back." Inside that cabinet, curled up in a space that seemed impossibly small, was Justin. His blonde hair, his little body. But there was no movement, no breath, no life. The boy they'd all been desperately searching for was right there, hidden away in a storage compartment, and he was dead. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Some people broke down sobbing right there. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. How could this be? They'd searched this camper. Multiple people had been through it. How had they missed him? Victor was quickly ushered away from the scene. So were the other civilians who'd rushed over. Within minutes, crime scene tape went up around the camper. This was no longer a search and rescue operation. This was a homicide investigation. But here's where things get really strange and deeply disturbing. The camper itself raises so many questions. According to later court documents and investigative reports, that travel camper was kept on the Turner property, and only Victor and Pamela Turner had keys to it. It wasn't a vehicle that lots of people had access to. It was family property, secured and relatively private. During the initial search on Friday, Deputy Philip Mason, one of the first responders to the 911 call, claimed he'd personally searched that camper. He went through it, looked around, found nothing unusual. On Saturday, Justin's paternal grandmother reportedly checked the camper as well. A neighbor also took a look inside. Multiple witnesses later stated that the body simply wasn't there during those first searches. So how did Justin end up in that cabinet by Sunday morning? The implications are chilling. If those witnesses were telling the truth, if the camper really had been checked and Justin's body wasn't there, then someone moved it. Someone took Justin's body from wherever it had been hidden and placed it in that cabinet sometime between Friday and Sunday morning. Think about what that means. Picture the scene. Dozens of investigators, volunteers, and family members are swarming the property. Everyone is searching frantically. And in the midst of all that chaos, someone manages to move a child's body into the camper without being seen. It's bold. It's brazen. It requires nerve and opportunity. And it suggests the person who did it was comfortable on that property. Someone who could move around without raising suspicion. Someone who knew the search patterns, who understood when investigators were focused elsewhere, who could slip into that camper unnoticed. Now, there is another possibility, one that investigators couldn't completely rule out. Maybe the initial searches weren't as thorough as everyone remembered. In the panic and chaos of a missing child case, with volunteers rushing around and emotions running high, it's possible that particular cabinet was never properly opened. Maybe people glanced inside the camper, saw nothing obvious, and moved on. Maybe Justin was there all along, and everyone just missed him. But that theory has problems too. Because Deputy Mason, a trained law enforcement officer, insisted he search the camper. When he was later given a polygraph test about the thoroughness of that search, he failed. That failure raised eyebrows. Was Mason lying about how well he'd searched? Or was the polygraph result inconclusive for other reasons? Polygraphs are controversial, of course. They're not admissible in court for a reason. They're not foolproof. Stress, anxiety, fear, exhaustion, all of these can affect results. Mason had been working nonstop for 2 days searching for a missing child. He was probably physically and emotionally drained. Could that have affected his polygraph? Absolutely. But the fact remains, he failed when asked about his search of the camper. And that became one more strange piece in an increasingly bizarre puzzle. Then there's Victor's discovery itself. The way he found Justin struck several people as odd. Captain Sidney Runn, one of the lead investigators, later noted that Victor went straight to that cabinet. He pulled it open immediately, as if he knew where to look. Within seconds of entering the camper, Victor was shouting that he'd found his son. Some investigators wondered, did Victor receive a tip? Did someone tell him where to look? Or, and this is the darkest possibility, did he already know Justin was there? At the scene, just after the body was discovered, Victor asked a law enforcement officer a strange question. According to witness reports, he said something along the lines of, "What would happen if someone in the family had done this?" It's an odd thing to ask in that moment. Your son's body has just been found. The natural reaction would be shock, grief, devastation. But Victor was asking about legal consequences for a family member being responsible. Investigators noted his tone as nervous when he asked it, almost as if he was probing, trying to gauge how law enforcement would handle a situation where someone in the household was involved. Was it an innocent question born of shock and confusion? Or was it something more calculated? We'll probably never know for certain. But that question stuck with investigators for years. As crime scene technicians began processing the camper, more disturbing details emerged. Justin's clothing was remarkably clean. No mud, no grass stains, no pine needles stuck to his shoes or pants. For a child who'd allegedly been missing for 2 days in a rural area full of woods, ponds, and dirt roads, That was strange. If Justin had wandered off into the forest and gotten lost, you'd expect his clothes to be dirty, torn, covered in evidence of him moving through the brush. If he'd been grabbed by someone on the road and carried off, there'd likely be some trace of the outdoors on him. But Justin's clothes were clean, almost pristine. That suggested something investigators found deeply troubling. Justin probably never made it outside that morning. He likely never walked down that dirt road toward the bus stop. Whatever happened to him probably happened inside the house, in a controlled environment, before he was carried to the camper. The cabinet where Justin was found was small, really small. It would have taken effort to place a child's body inside and arrange it so the door would close. This wasn't a case of Justin climbing in there himself, falling asleep, and accidentally dying. The positioning suggested he'd been placed there deliberately, hidden away. And there's another crucial detail. The camper was usually kept locked. According to affidavits filed later in the case, Victor and Pamela Turner were the only ones with keys and regular access to that camper before Justin's body was discovered. Yes, during the search, many people went in and out, but that was after the fact, after Pamela had reported Justin missing. Before Friday afternoon, that camper was essentially private family property. All of these facts, the clean clothing, the locked camper, the suspicious timing, Victor's immediate discovery, his strange question to the officer, they all pointed in one uncomfortable direction. Inward, toward the family. As word spread through the community that Justin had been found dead, the mood shifted dramatically. The hope that had sustained everyone through 2 days of searching evaporated instantly. In its place came grief, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. This wasn't a case of a little boy wandering off and getting lost. This wasn't even a random predator snatching a child off the street. This was murder. Calculated, deliberate murder. And the killer had hidden Justin's body right under everyone's noses, in a camper that multiple people had supposedly searched. The boldness of it was shocking. The cruelty of it was unforgivable. Neighbors who'd volunteered for the search felt sick. They'd been out there for 2 days, calling Justin's name, hoping he'd respond, believing they were helping to bring him home safely. And all along, his body had been right there on the property. Some of them had probably walked past that camper dozens of times. The small community of Monk's Corner, which had come together in such a powerful way to search for Justin, now found itself reeling. Parents hugged their children tighter. Churches held prayer services not just for Justin, but for healing and understanding. How could this have happened? Who could do something like this to a 5-year-old boy? For Justin's maternal family, his mother Elaine, his grandfather, his cousins, the grief was compounded by suspicion. They'd always had concerns about Justin living with Victor and Pamela after the custody battle. Now their worst fears had come true. Justin was dead, found on the very property where he'd been living. In their hearts, they already suspected who was responsible. But suspicion isn't proof. And as investigators would soon discover, proving what happened to Justin Turner would be far more difficult than anyone imagined. As the crime scene was processed that Sunday, as Justin's small body was taken away for autopsy, as investigators began the painstaking work of collecting evidence, one question dominated every conversation. Who did this? The search for Justin was over. But the search for his killer, the search for justice, was just beginning. And it would take 35 years, multiple investigations, advanced forensic technology, and a community's unwavering determination to get even close to an answer. What happened next would test the limits of the justice system and leave a family forever divided between those who sought the truth and those who maintained their innocence against all odds. When Berkeley County forensic technicians and medical examiners began processing Justin Turner's body, they uncovered details so disturbing that even veteran investigators, people who'd seen plenty of terrible things in their careers, were shaken to their core. The autopsy results told a story of violence, of suffering, of a crime so heinous that it would haunt everyone involved for decades. Justin Lee Turner died by ligature strangulation. In simpler terms, someone had used some kind of strap or cord to choke the life out of a 5-year-old boy. The medical examiner found clear ligature marks around Justin's neck, the unmistakable signs of pressure from something thin and strong wrapped around his throat until he couldn't breathe anymore. But the horror didn't stop there. The autopsy also revealed signs of sexual assault. Justin had been violated with a cylindrical object, causing injuries that made it clear this attack had a sexual component. We're talking about a kindergartner, a child who should have been learning his ABCs, playing with toys, watching cartoons. Instead, his final moments involved unspeakable abuse. Captain Sidney Ron, one of the lead investigators, would later say, "I can't think of a more tragic, horrendous murder of a 5-year-old boy." That statement, coming from someone who'd spent years in law enforcement and had likely worked plenty of difficult cases, speaks volumes about how deeply this crime affected everyone involved. The medical examiner was able to establish a rough timeline based on the contents of Justin's stomach. Remember that bowl of cinnamon cereal Justin had eaten for breakfast? The autopsy found undigested food still in his stomach, which meant Justin had died relatively soon after eating, probably somewhere between late morning and early afternoon on Friday, March 3rd. Think about that timeline for a moment. Justin was supposed to leave for the school bus around 8 o'clock or 8:30 that morning. The autopsy suggested he died sometime between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. that same day. That window is significant because it means Justin probably never left the house at all. He died during the same time frame when he should have been at school, sitting in his kindergarten classroom, playing with his friends during recess. But here's where things get even stranger and more disturbing. When searchers recovered Justin's body from that camper cabinet on Sunday morning, multiple people remarked on how cold he felt. Unusually cold. Not just regular deceased body cold, but almost icy to the touch. Several searchers specifically remembered this detail because it struck them as odd. Bodies cool after death, of course. That's natural. But Justin had been missing for about 48 hours, and South Carolina in early March isn't exactly freezing cold. Nighttime temperatures might have dipped into the 40s or 50s Fahrenheit, but nothing extreme. So why did Justin's body feel so cold? This observation led investigators to develop a theory. What if Justin's body had been refrigerated or frozen at some point before being placed in the camper? Think about the implications. If the killer had stored Justin's body in a freezer or some other cold environment, it would serve multiple purposes. First, it would slow decomposition, reducing any odor that might attract attention during the search. Second, it would provide a hiding place while investigators combed through the property. The killer could keep the body on ice, so to speak, until the intensive search died down, then move it to a location where it would eventually be found. Investigators acted on this theory. During their crime scene sweep of the Turner property, they seized a chest freezer from the home and examined it carefully. They were looking for any trace evidence, blood, hair, fibers, anything that might indicate a body had been stored inside. But they came up empty. The freezer showed no biological traces of Justin. No blood, no hair, nothing. So what explained the unusual coldness? A forensic analyst later reviewed the findings and determined that there wasn't conclusive evidence of artificial refrigeration. The coldness could have been due to normal post-mortem cooling over 2 cool spring nights. It might also have been a subjective impression. Searchers who were emotionally devastated and physically exhausted might have perceived the body as colder than it actually was. The refrigeration theory, while plausible and creepy, couldn't be proven. So investigators eventually set it aside. But the question remained. If Justin's body wasn't in a freezer, where had it been hidden for those first 2 days? The Turner house had been thoroughly searched. Under beds, in closets, the attic, the basement, nothing. The outbuildings, the vehicles, the yard, nothing. So where was Justin between Friday morning, when he died, and Sunday morning, when he was found? Some investigators theorized that Justin might have been temporarily hidden in an obscure spot on the property, maybe that storage shed, maybe another vehicle, maybe wrapped up and tucked away somewhere that wasn't immediately obvious. Then, once the intensive grid searches began to wind down on Saturday night and Sunday morning, the killer moved the body into the camper. But nobody could identify a definitive hiding place. And without that crucial piece of information, the prosecution's theory of the crime had a significant hole in it. Let's talk about the ligature itself, the weapon used to strangle Justin. Investigators believed it was some kind of strap, possibly a dog leash. The Turner family owned a dog, and a dog leash was indeed seized from the home as potential evidence. The marks on Justin's neck were consistent with a thin, strong strap like you'd find on a leash. But here's the complication. The width and pattern of the ligature marks also suggested that maybe a dog collar had been used in conjunction with the leash or instead of it. Medical experts debated this point. Some thought the marks indicated just a leash. Others thought a collar made more sense based on the width of the indentations on Justin's neck. The problem? The dog collar was never found. If it existed, if it was indeed the murder weapon, where was it? Investigators couldn't locate it among the evidence collected from the property. They even took the rather macabre step of exhuming the remains of the Turner family dog years later to see if the collar had been buried with the pet. But they found nothing. This missing collar, or debate over whether a collar was even involved, would become a point of contention in later court proceedings. The defense would argue that the state kept changing its theory about the murder weapon. First it was a leash, then maybe a collar, then maybe both. And how could defendants mount a proper defense when the prosecution couldn't even settle on what was used to kill Justin? The physical evidence collected from the scene was extensive, but ultimately frustrating. Investigators gathered hair samples, fiber samples, fingerprints, and various items from the Turner home. They were looking for that one smoking gun piece of evidence that would definitively link someone to the crime. But therein lay the problem, a problem that would plague this case for decades. Everyone in the Turner household had a legitimate reason to have their DNA, fingerprints, and fibers on Justin and throughout the house. Victor was Justin's father. Pamela was his stepmother. They all lived together. They shared spaces, touched the same objects, wore clothes that might transfer fibers. So when forensic analysis found Victor's hair on Justin's clothing or Pamela's fingerprints in the camper, what did that prove? Nothing. It was expected. It was explainable under normal, innocent circumstances. Captain Wren later lamented this exact issue. No DNA evidence will ever go back to solve this case because it had a right to be where it was at. No hair particles could ever be brought back because it had a right to be where it was at. In other words, the forensic evidence was essentially useless for proving guilt. There was no unknown fingerprint, no foreign DNA profile, no clear biological evidence from a stranger or outside party. Everything found at the scene belonged to people who lived there. This is the nightmare scenario in any homicide investigation involving family members. Without a clear external suspect, without evidence from someone who shouldn't have been there, you're left building a case on circumstantial evidence, behavior, inconsistencies, and motive. And circumstantial cases are hard to prosecute. Let's talk about the crime scene itself for a moment. The camper where Justin was found was a confined space. To place a child's body in that particular cabinet would require someone to open the camper door, enter the space, open the specific cabinet, position the body inside, and close everything back up. It wasn't something you could do in 2 seconds. It would take time, maybe a minute or two, maybe more. You'd need to be confident you wouldn't be seen or interrupted. You'd need to know the property well enough to move around without drawing attention. And you'd need access. That camper was typically kept locked. Only family members had keys. All of these factors pointed investigators toward a hard truth. This was almost certainly an inside job. Not a random stranger. Not a drifter passing through. Not some predator who happened to be in the area. This was someone who lived on or had regular access to that property. Someone who knew the layout, knew the routines, knew when they could move without being detected. The sexual assault component also raised questions. Child sexual abuse, particularly in cases involving murder, often has certain patterns. It's rare for a complete stranger to abduct a child, assault them, and then hide the body on the victim's own property. That's not how those crimes typically unfold. More often, when children are sexually assaulted and murdered, especially in their own homes or nearby, the perpetrator is someone known to the child, someone trusted, someone with access and opportunity. Everything, the location, the evidence, the circumstances, the timeline, pointed toward the household, toward Victor and Pamela Turner. But pointing toward them wasn't the same as proving they did it. And as investigators would soon discover, suspicion without solid proof wouldn't be enough to bring Justin's killer to justice. As the investigation moved forward in those first weeks after Justin's death, the forensic picture became clearer even as the path to justice became murkier. Yes, investigators knew how Justin died. Yes, they knew roughly when. Yes, they had strong suspicions about who was responsible, but they couldn't definitively prove it. Not yet. And that gap between suspicion and proof would define this case for the next 35 years. The evidence haunted the investigators who worked on it. The image of that little boy, curled up in that cabinet, the ligature marks on his neck, the knowledge of what he'd endured in his final moments, it stayed with them. Some of those investigators never forgot Justin Turner. They carried his case with them, even into retirement, hoping that someday, somehow, justice would be served. And as we'll see in the chapters ahead, that hope would be tested again and again as the case took turns nobody could have predicted. In any missing child case, investigators follow a basic protocol. Start with the family and work your way out. It's not because law enforcement assumes families are guilty. It's because statistically, when children are harmed, the perpetrator is usually someone close to them, someone with access, someone trusted. In Justin Turner's case, that protocol led investigators straight to his immediate household, his father, Victor Turner, and his stepmother, Pamela Turner. Let's start with Pamela, because she became the primary focus of suspicion almost immediately. From the very beginning, Pamela's story had problems. When she first called 911 on Friday afternoon to report Justin missing, she told dispatchers that Justin had gotten on the school bus that morning and gone to school. She claimed he'd disappeared sometime during or after the school day. The implication was that maybe something had happened at school or on the bus ride home, or somewhere between the school and the house. But that story fell apart within hours. When investigators checked with Whitesville Elementary School, the teachers confirmed that Justin never arrived that day. He wasn't on the bus. He wasn't in class. Nobody at the school had seen him at all. So Pamela's first story was demonstrably false. When confronted with this contradiction, Pamela changed her account. She said she'd been in the shower that morning and just assumed Justin had left for the bus on his own like he always did. She hadn't actually seen him leave. She only realized something was wrong when he didn't come home on the bus that afternoon. That's when she started asking neighbors if they'd seen him. But that revised story had problems too. Neighbors who lived along the road, people who would have seen Justin walking to the bus stop, said they never saw him that morning. Justin's best friend, the neighbor boy who usually met Justin at his grandmother's house to catch the bus together, said Justin never showed up. The friend waited, assumed Justin was staying home sick, and got on the bus without him. All of this pointed to a disturbing conclusion. Justin probably never left the house that morning. He never walked down that dirt road. He never made it outside at all. So why was Pamela saying otherwise? Then there was the matter of the argument. Under pressure from investigators, Pamela eventually admitted something she hadn't mentioned initially. She'd had an argument with Justin that morning. A confrontation over his behavior, as she described it. Some witnesses later told investigators they'd heard or seen Pamela disciplining Justin earlier on March 3rd, and the interaction had been heated. Now, let's be clear, parents argue with their kids. It's normal. 5-year-olds can be difficult sometimes. They throw tantrums, they don't listen, they test boundaries. A parent scolding a child for misbehavior isn't evidence of murder. But Pamela hadn't mentioned this argument initially. She only admitted to it after investigators pressed her on inconsistencies in her story. And in a case where a child ends up dead just hours after an argument with a parental figure, that confrontation takes on a much darker significance. Did the argument escalate? Did Pamela lose her temper? Did something happen in the heat of that moment that spiraled out of control? Investigators certainly thought it was possible. On March 6, 1989, the Monday after Justin's body was found, Pamela agreed to take a polygraph test. Polygraphs, as we've mentioned, are controversial. They measure physiological responses like heart rate, breathing, and perspiration while a person answers questions. The idea is that lying causes stress, which triggers these physiological changes. But polygraphs aren't perfect. Stress, anxiety, fear, exhaustion, medications, all of these can affect results. That's why polygraph evidence isn't admissible in court. They're investigative tools, not definitive proof of anything. Still, when Pamela failed her polygraph test, it raised serious red flags for investigators. Pamela later claimed she'd taken Valium before the polygraph, presumably to calm her nerves, which is understandable given the circumstances. But Valium can absolutely affect polygraph results by dampening physiological responses. Investigators scheduled a second test, hoping to get clearer results. That second test never happened. Because right around that time, the Berkeley County Sheriff publicly announced to the media that Pamela K. Turner was being considered a suspect in Justin's murder. Imagine being in Pamela's position for a moment. Your stepson has just been found murdered on your property. You're grieving, or at least you should be. You're trying to cooperate with investigators. And then suddenly, before any formal charges have been filed, the sheriff tells every news outlet in South Carolina that you're a suspect. Pamela and her family were furious. They felt she was being convicted in the court of public opinion before she'd even had a chance to defend herself properly. On the advice of an attorney, Pamela immediately stopped cooperating with investigators. The second polygraph was canceled. From that point forward, Pamela exercised her Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Now, legally, she had every right to do that. The Fifth Amendment exists for a reason, to protect people from self-incrimination, to ensure fair legal process. Refusing to answer questions without a lawyer present is not evidence of guilt. It's smart legal strategy. But from an investigative standpoint, Pamela's silence made things much harder. Investigators couldn't clear up inconsistencies in her story. They couldn't ask follow-up questions. They couldn't probe deeper into the timeline of that morning or the details of her argument with Justin. The case against Pamela was largely circumstantial. She'd lied about Justin going to school. She'd initially hidden the argument she'd had with him. She failed a polygraph test, though that failure could have alternative explanations. She was in the house when Justin presumably died. She had access to the camper where the body was found. But there was no physical evidence directly tying her to the act of killing Justin. No fingerprints on the ligature. No blood evidence. No witnesses who saw her harm the child. Just suspicions. Strong suspicions, yes, but suspicions nonetheless. Now let's talk about Victor Turner, Justin's biological father. Victor wasn't the primary suspect initially. The focus was mainly on Pamela. But Victor's behavior raised questions too, particularly around the discovery of Justin's body. Remember how Victor found Justin in that camper? He went straight to the cabinet, pulled it open, and immediately started shouting. It was almost as if he knew where to look. Investigators noticed this. How did Victor zero in on that exact spot so quickly? Captain Wren later noted that Victor pulled the cabinet right open, as if he knew where to look. That phrase, as if he knew, carries a heavy implication. Did Victor have foreknowledge? Had someone told him where the body was? Or had he been involved in placing it there himself? Then there was that strange question Victor asked right after finding the body. According to witnesses at the scene, Victor approached a law enforcement officer and asked something along the lines of, "What would happen if someone in the family had done this?" Why would you ask that question in that moment? Your son's body has just been found murdered. Shouldn't your first reaction be shock? Grief? Horror? Why are you immediately inquiring about legal consequences for family members being responsible? Some investigators saw this as Victor testing the waters, trying to gauge how much trouble he or Pamela might be in. Others thought maybe it was just an innocent question born of confusion and shock. Maybe Victor was trying to understand the investigation, or maybe he'd heard people whispering suspicions about the family and wanted to know what that meant legally. We'll never know for certain what was in Victor's mind when he asked that question, but it stuck with investigators. It was one more strange piece in a puzzle full of strange pieces. Victor also agreed to take a polygraph test. And just like Pamela, he failed. 2 failed polygraphs from the 2 adults who lived in the house with Justin. Again, polygraphs aren't foolproof, and failing one doesn't automatically mean you're guilty. But when both parents fail, and both are the last people known to have seen the victim alive, it certainly looks suspicious. Within days of failing their polygraph tests, Victor and Pamela hired an attorney and stopped cooperating with the investigation entirely. They invoked their rights, which again, is completely legal. But from law enforcement's perspective, it felt like a wall had gone up just when they were getting close to answers. Investigators continued building their case through other means. They interviewed neighbors, family members, school officials, anyone who might have relevant information. Some of those interviews yielded interesting details. At least one witness recalled Pamela making a disturbing comment around the time of Justin's disappearance. According to this witness, Pamela had said something that implied she'd had a big fight with Justin that morning, and that she'd won that fight. It's a chilling way to describe an encounter with a 5-year-old child. What does it mean to win a fight with a kindergartner? And why would you frame it that way? Other witnesses provided information about the Turner household dynamic. Some described tension between Pamela and Justin. Others said they'd never seen anything concerning. The picture that emerged was complicated and contradictory, as witness accounts often are. One crucial fact remained undisputed. No one outside the household reported seeing Justin that morning. No strangers were spotted in the area. No suspicious vehicles. No unusual activity. The only people who definitively knew where Justin was on the morning of March 3rd were the people inside that house. Despite all the suspicions, Despite the failed polygraphs and the inconsistent statements, prosecutors faced a significant problem. They couldn't definitively prove who killed Justin or exactly how it happened. The physical evidence, as we discussed in the last chapter, was essentially useless because everyone in the household had legitimate reason to have their DNA and fingerprints on Justin and throughout the property. The timeline was circumstantial. Yes, Justin probably died between late morning and early afternoon. Yes, only Victor and Pamela were home during that window. But could prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that one or both of them had strangled Justin and hidden his body? That was a much higher bar to clear. Still, in December 1989, about 9 months after Justin's death, Berkeley County prosecutors felt they had enough to move forward. A grand jury was convened to hear the evidence against Pamela Turner. Grand juries operate differently than regular trials. There's no defense attorney present. The prosecutor presents evidence and asks the grand jury to decide whether there's probable cause to believe a crime was committed and that the defendant committed it. The standard is much lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. It's more like, is there enough here to justify a trial? In December 1989, the grand jury voted to indict Pamela Turner for murder. She was arrested, booked into jail, and released on a $100,000 bond. The arrest made headlines across South Carolina. Justin's childhood friend, devastated by the news, told reporters, "I hope they find the people who did it and put them in the electric chair." The community was divided. Some people were convinced Pamela was guilty and felt relief that someone was finally being held accountable. Others who knew Pamela found it hard to believe she could commit such a horrific crime. But the legal battle was just beginning. And as we'll see in the next chapter, bringing Pamela Turner to trial would prove far more difficult than prosecutors ever imagined. In early 1990, Pamela Turner stood charged with the murder of her 5-year-old stepson. The case was moving through preliminary proceedings, evidence was being presented, and it looked like Justin's family might finally get their day in court, might finally see justice. But then something happened that would devastate Justin's loved ones and haunt them for decades. The case fell apart. In mid-1990, Berkeley County prosecutors presented their evidence to a grand jury, seeking a formal indictment that would send Pamela to trial. They laid out everything they had: the inconsistent statements, the failed polygraph, the suspicious circumstances, the fact that Justin died in a home where only Pamela and Victor were present. The grand jury reviewed it all, and then they refused to indict. Let that sink in for a moment. The grand jury, which operates on a much lower standard than a trial jury, didn't even think there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. The murder charge against Pamela Turner was dropped. Legally, she was free. The case reverted to an unsolved homicide. No one would be held accountable. The Berkeley County Sheriff's Office publicly stated that Pamela Turner remained a suspect and that the investigation would stay open. But without an indictment, without charges, there was nowhere for the case to go. The momentum died. The spotlight moved on. And Pamela and Victor Turner were left to pick up the pieces of their lives under a permanent cloud of suspicion. For Justin's maternal family, especially his mother, Elaine Pace, this was an unbearable outcome. Elaine had spent months hoping, praying, believing that someone would finally be held responsible for her son's death. She'd cooperated fully with investigators, provided any information she could, supported the prosecution's case. And now, it was just over. No trial, no conviction, no justice. But Elaine refused to give up. She became a vocal advocate for her son, regularly contacting the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office to ask about the case, to see if any new leads had emerged, to make sure Justin wasn't forgotten. She spoke to local media whenever they'd listen, keeping Justin's story in the public eye. She wanted everyone to know that her son's killer was still out there, still free. Meanwhile, Victor and Pamela Turner did what many people in their position would do. They tried to move on. Shortly after the charges were dropped, they relocated away from Berkeley County. The community of Moncks Corner had essentially convicted them in the court of public opinion, even if the legal system hadn't. They couldn't walk down the street without people staring, whispering, judging. So they left. They moved to a different county in South Carolina and tried to build a new life away from the infamy. Pamela even went so far as to legally change her first name from Pamela to Megan. It was a fresh start, a way to distance herself from the person everyone associated with Justin's murder. From that point forward, she went by Megan Turner. When people Googled Pamela Turner, they'd find articles about the case. But Megan Turner? That was just a regular person trying to live a quiet life. Here's what struck investigators as particularly telling. After Victor and Pamela, now Megan, moved away, they never contacted the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office again. Not once. They never called to check on the status of the investigation, never asked if new leads had emerged, never inquired whether the real killer had been found. Think about that for a moment. If your child had been murdered and the case was unsolved, wouldn't you be calling constantly? Wouldn't you want updates? Wouldn't you be desperate to know if investigators were getting any closer to finding out who did it? But Victor and Megan never called, never asked. It was as if, once they'd left Monk's Corner, they wanted nothing to do with the investigation into Justin's death. To law enforcement, this silence spoke volumes. Compare it to Elaine Pace's behavior. She was calling regularly, pushing for progress, refusing to let the case go cold. That's what you'd expect from a parent who lost a child. But from Victor and Megan? Nothing but silence. Of course, one could argue they had valid reasons for staying away. They'd been accused, investigated, arrested, dragged through the media. Maybe they felt the police had tunnel vision, that investigators were so convinced of their guilt that any contact would just invite more scrutiny. Maybe their attorney advised them to maintain distance. But still, their complete disengagement from the search for Justin's killer struck many people as odd, to say the least. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Justin Turner's case remained technically open but effectively dormant. Occasionally, a new lead would trickle in. In January 1991, for example, a 6-year-old neighborhood boy claimed he'd witnessed Justin's abduction on the day he vanished. He said he saw a man take Justin. Investigators interviewed the child, but his story fell apart under scrutiny. The details were inconsistent. It became apparent that the boy had likely overheard adults talking about the case, and his young mind had constructed a memory based on those conversations. It's not that he was deliberately lying. Children sometimes create false memories based on things they've heard, especially around traumatic community events. The lead went nowhere. Other tips and theories emerged over the years, but none of them panned out. No physical evidence surfaced. No witness came forward with credible information. The case just sat there, unsolved and seemingly unsolvable. For Elaine Pace, every year that passed without answers was another year of torture. She'd lost her son in the most horrific way imaginable. And then she'd lost the chance for justice when the charges against Pamela were dropped. All she could do was keep Justin's memory alive and keep pressuring law enforcement to find answers. But the emotional and physical toll was devastating. In 2004, at the age of 47, Elaine Pace passed away after a long illness. She'd spent 15 years fighting for justice for Justin, 15 years of phone calls to investigators, media interviews, sleepless nights, and unanswered questions. And she died without ever seeing anyone held accountable for her son's death. Before she passed, Elaine made her husband, Russell Pace, promise that he would continue the fight. "She told me not to give up," Russell later said. "Keep it in the news. Fight the battle for her." And Russell did. He committed to fulfilling Elaine's dying wish, carrying the torch of justice for Justin even after the boy's mother was gone. He stayed in contact with investigators, spoke to media when opportunities arose, and kept the case from being completely forgotten. But as the 2000s stretched on, it seemed increasingly likely that Justin's murder would remain forever unsolved. Too much time had passed. Key witnesses were aging or dying. Physical evidence from 1989 was degrading. The investigation had gone cold, not just cold, but frozen solid. By 2014, it had been 25 years since Justin's death. A quarter of a century. Justin would have been 30 years old if he'd lived. Maybe married, maybe with children of his own. Instead, his life had been cut short at 5, and his killer had never faced justice. That's when Justin's extended family decided to take action. Justin's cousin, Amy Parsons, had been only 8 years old when Justin was murdered. She'd grown up in the shadow of that tragedy, watching her family grieve, watching her Aunt Elaine fight, and ultimately lose her battle for justice. Amy had always promised herself that she wouldn't let Justin be forgotten. In 2014, on the 25th anniversary of Justin's death, Amy created a Facebook page called Justice for Justin Lee Turner. The goal was to reignite public interest in the case, to put pressure on law enforcement to take another look, and to remind everyone that a killer had gotten away with murder. Amy and other family members gave interviews to local media. They posted photos of Justin, that sweet kindergarten face with blonde hair and blue eyes, and shared memories of the boy he'd been. They organized awareness campaigns and encouraged anyone with information to come forward. Somebody has lived with this for now over 25 years, Amy told reporters. That's a long time to live with a weight on your shoulders. Come forward. End it now. It's as simple as that. Her plea was directed both at anyone who might have information about the crime and, perhaps, at the killer's conscience. If Victor or Megan, or anyone else, knew what really happened to Justin, Amy was begging them to finally tell the truth. The family's renewed push gained traction on social media and in local news outlets. People who'd forgotten about Justin's case were reminded. Younger people who'd never heard about it learned the story for the first time. And slowly, pressure began building on the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office to revisit the case. In 2015, Dwayne Lewis was elected as the new Berkeley County Sheriff. He inherited a department with a stack of cold cases, and Justin Turner's case was right near the top. Sheriff Lewis reviewed the file and was struck by how many questions remained unanswered. He met with Justin's family and heard their pain, their frustration, their desperate desire for justice. In March 2016, 27 years after the crime, Sheriff Lewis made a public announcement. He was officially reopening the Justin Turner cold case. A new team of investigators would review all the evidence with fresh eyes. They'd conduct new interviews where possible, and they'd apply modern forensic techniques to the physical evidence that had been preserved since 1989. We have some items in the 1989 case file that we may be able to use with modern forensic testing, Sheriff Lewis told the media. It was a cautious statement. He wasn't promising results, but he was promising effort. For Justin's family, this announcement was the first real glimmer of hope they'd had in over 2 decades. Maybe, just maybe, new technology could find something the 1989 investigation had missed. Maybe DNA testing or fiber analysis or some other technique could finally provide the proof needed to hold someone accountable. One of the original investigators, Captain Sidney Runn, was consulted as the case was reopened. By this point, Runn was long retired, but he'd never forgotten Justin Turner. In interviews, Runn made his feelings crystal clear. He believed the crime scene had been staged, and he believed Victor and Pamela, Megan, Turner were hiding the truth. I found it highly suspicious that no investigator was able to find the child's body in the camper during the initial search, yet Victor found him so readily, Runn said. He believed that if he'd been allowed to continue pursuing the case against Pamela in 1990, it could have led to a conviction. But that was water under the bridge now. The question was, could the new cold case team succeed where the 1989 investigation had failed? Over the next several years, Sheriff Lewis's investigators worked methodically through the evidence. They reviewed witness statements, re-interviewed people where possible, and sent physical evidence to forensic labs for modern analysis. It was slow, painstaking work, but they were determined. And in 2021, 32 years after Justin's death, they finally found something. Something that would change everything. For over 3 decades, Justin Turner's murder had been defined by what investigators couldn't prove. They couldn't prove who killed him. They couldn't prove how the body got into the camper. They couldn't produce that one definitive piece of evidence that would stand up in court and convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. But in 2021, Sheriff Dwayne Lewis's cold case team finally caught a break. Remember the ligature used to strangle Justin? Back in 1989, investigators had believed it was some kind of strap, possibly a dog leash. They'd seized a dog leash from the Turner home as potential evidence, noting that the marks on Justin's neck were consistent with a thin, strong strap. But in 1989, forensic technology was limited. They could look at the leash, compare it visually to the marks, and make educated guesses. But they couldn't do the kind of detailed analysis that would become possible decades later. Fast forward to 2021. The cold case team took that same dog leash, preserved in evidence for 32 years, and subjected it to modern forensic examination. Using advanced microscopy and fiber analysis techniques that simply didn't exist in 1989, forensic experts made a discovery. They found microscopic fibers from the leash that matched fibers embedded in the ligature marks on Justin's neck and on his shirt collar. These weren't just similar fibers, they were a forensic match. The same material, the same composition. The fibers found on Justin's body came from that dog leash in the Turner home. This was huge. This was the physical evidence link that had eluded investigators for 3 decades. Sheriff Lewis credited the breakthrough to new technology and forensic medicine, explaining that persistent testing and retesting of evidence over the years had finally gotten what we needed. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait, didn't they already know the leash was probably the murder weapon back in 1989? What's new about this? Here's the difference. In 1989, they had a theory. In 2021, they had proof. Scientific, forensic proof that could be presented in court. The fiber match provided a concrete link between an object from the Turner household and the murder itself, combined with all the other circumstantial evidence. The inconsistent statements, the failed polygraphs, the suspicious circumstances of the body's discovery. The cold case team felt they finally had enough to build a prosecutable case. But the investigation didn't stop there. Investigators re-emphasized several other key facts that, when viewed together, painted a damning picture. First, Justin's clothing was clean. No dirt, no mud, no leaves, no pine needles. For a child who'd supposedly been walking down a dirt road and then gone missing for 2 days, that made no sense. It suggested Justin had never made it outside that morning. He'd been killed indoors, in a controlled environment, and then carried to the camper. Second, the specific location where Justin's body was hidden, inside that built-in cabinet in the camper, indicated intimate knowledge of the property. This wasn't a spot a random person would choose. It was tucked away, not immediately visible, but it was a place someone who knew the camper would think to use. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the probable cause affidavit filed later in the case stated that Victor and Pamela Turner were the only individuals with keys and regular access to that camper before Justin's body was discovered. Only them. If Justin was killed inside the house, carried to the camper, and hidden in a cabinet that required keys to access, then the pool of possible suspects was incredibly small. Essentially just 2 people. The cold case team also looked at the timeline again with fresh eyes. The autopsy had established that Justin died sometime between late morning and early afternoon on March 3, 1989. During that window, only Victor and Pamela were home. There were no visitors, no delivery people, no strangers on the property. And according to Pamela's own statements, after her initial lies were disproven, she was in the house that entire morning. She claimed she was in the shower and didn't see Justin leave. But if Justin never left, if he died inside the house during those hours, then Pamela would have been there when it happened. Victor's behavior also came under renewed scrutiny. The way he found Justin's body so quickly, the question he asked about what would happen to a family member who was responsible, his and Pamela's immediate cessation of cooperation after failing their polygraphs. All of it looked even more suspicious 3 decades later. By April 2021, the cold case team had compiled everything into a comprehensive case file. They had the fiber evidence. They had the circumstantial evidence. They had witness statements from 1989. They had expert testimony about the cause of death and the timeline. And they believed they finally had enough to arrest Victor and Megan Turner. But here's where things get complicated. The decision to arrest isn't just about what investigators believe. It's about what prosecutors think they can prove in court. And after 32 years, there were significant concerns about whether this case could actually be successfully prosecuted. Many of the original witnesses were dead. Key investigators from 1989 had passed away. Justin's mother, Elaine, who could have provided crucial testimony about the custody situation and the family dynamics, died in 2004. The medical examiner who performed Justin's autopsy might no longer be alive or able to testify. Physical evidence had degraded over time. Some items from 1989 were still preserved, but others might have been lost or compromised during 3 decades of storage. And while the fiber evidence was strong, it wasn't quite the smoking gun that DNA from an unknown assailant would have been. Still, after extensive consultation with the Ninth Circuit Solicitor's Office, the prosecutors who would handle the case, the decision was made to move forward. The fiber evidence, combined with everything else, established probable cause for arrest. Whether it would be enough for conviction would be up to a jury. But there was one more complication to consider: double jeopardy. Pamela Turner had been arrested and charged with murder back in 1989, but the charges were dropped when the grand jury refused to indict. Does that count as jeopardy? Could she be charged again? Legal experts consulted on the case determined that no, it didn't constitute double jeopardy. Pamela was never tried, never acquitted or convicted. The charges were simply dismissed before trial. Therefore, she could legally be charged again if new evidence warranted it. And as for Victor, he'd never been charged in 1989, so there were no legal barriers to charging him now. On January 9, 2024, nearly 35 years after Justin's murder, Berkeley County Sheriff's deputies executed arrest warrants for both Megan, formerly Pamela, Turner, and Victor Turner. They were living in Cross Hill, South Carolina, in Lawrence County, having built a quiet life away from the spotlight of Moncks Corner. The arrests were carried out without incident. Both Victor and Megan were taken into custody and charged with one count of murder in the death of Justin Lee Turner. The news exploded across South Carolina media. After 35 years, someone was finally being held accountable for the murder of that little kindergartner who'd vanished on his way to the school bus. Sheriff Lewis held a press conference, displaying Justin's kindergarten photo and announcing the breakthrough. "We know for a fact that Justin was strangled to death," he said. "There were ligature marks on his neck. We recovered what we believe to be the evidence of the murder weapon. We have a lot of forensic evidence. We got here because of new technology and forensic science." For Justin's family, particularly his cousin Amy Parsons, the arrests were vindication. "For 30 years, you enjoyed your freedom," Amy wrote in a fiery social media post directed at the Turners. "You did not observe one day inside of a prison cell for what you did to Justin. You were supposed to take care of him, love him, and instead you tortured, abused, and murdered your own child. It takes a sick individual to do what you did to that baby, and I hope you never see life outside of prison walls." The family wore buttons with Justin's face to every court hearing. They made sure that everyone in that courtroom, the judge, the defense attorneys, the prosecutors, the media, saw Justin. They wanted everyone to remember that this wasn't just an abstract legal case. This was about a real child whose life had been stolen. At a bond hearing in February 2024, both Victor and Megan were granted release on $50,000 surety bonds. The amount was surprisingly low given the severity of the charge, but the judge likely considered factors like their age. They were now in their late 60s, their lack of criminal history since 1989, and their ties to the community. The conditions of their bond were strict: surrender passports, remain in South Carolina, and have no contact with Justin's maternal family. That last condition was crucial because emotions were running incredibly high. Justin's family members were understandably furious that Victor and Megan had been free for 35 years, and the thought of encountering them in the courthouse hallways was unbearable. Megan Turner was released on February 8, 2024. Victor Turner posted bond the following day. For a brief moment, it seemed like justice might finally be served. The case that had haunted Berkeley County for over 3 decades was moving toward trial. Prosecutors were confident in their evidence. Justin's family was hopeful that they'd finally see a conviction. But as we'll see in the final chapter, the path to justice is never simple. And sometimes, even when you have evidence, even when you have probable cause, even when you have the defendants in custody, justice can still slip away. What happened next would shock everyone involved in the case and leave Justin's family devastated all over again. In March 2024, as Victor and Megan Turner prepared for trial, their defense attorney, Shay Kent, filed a motion that would change everything. Kent argued that the charges against his clients should be dismissed, not because they were innocent, but because too much time had passed. 35 years. That's how long it had been since Justin's murder. 3.5 decades. And according to Kent, prosecuting a case that violated his client's constitutional rights to a fair trial. Think about what 35 years means in practical terms. It means witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Physical evidence has degraded. The investigative techniques used in 1989 don't match what's available today, and that creates complications when trying to challenge or verify old evidence. Kent's motion laid out a detailed argument. More than 20 potential witnesses from the original investigation were now dead or otherwise unavailable to testify. This included neighbors who'd supposedly heard incriminating statements from the Turners, law enforcement officers who'd been part of the initial search, possibly even medical examiners and forensic experts from 1989. In a criminal trial, the defense has the right to cross-examine witnesses. It's a fundamental part of due process. But how do you cross-examine a dead person? How do you challenge testimony that was recorded 35 years ago when you can't confront the witness directly? Kent argued this put his clients at a severe disadvantage. The prosecution could introduce statements and testimony from 1989, but the defense couldn't properly challenge it. That, Kent contended, was inherently unfair. But Kent didn't stop there. He introduced a bombshell theory that nobody saw coming. What if the real killer wasn't Victor or Megan Turner at all? What if it was a serial killer named Richard Mark Evenitz? This claim came out of nowhere and hit like a thunderbolt. Richard Mark Evenitz was a convicted serial killer who'd murdered at least 3 girls in Virginia in the late 1990s. He died by suicide in 2002 as police were closing in on him. But here's the key detail. In 1989, at the time of Justin Turner's murder, Evenitz was a U.S. Navy sailor stationed in Charleston, South Carolina, just 30 miles from Moncks Corner. Kent presented information allegedly obtained through the Innocence Project at the University of Virginia, suggesting that Evenitz's known methods, kidnapping children, strangling them, sexual assault, bore similarities to Justin Turner's case. If Evenitz was in the area in 1989, if he had access to the region where Justin lived, and if his pattern of offending matched the crime, could he have been responsible? The defense argued that because Evenitz was cremated after his death, no DNA comparison could be made to definitively exclude him as a suspect. And because evidence from 1989 had degraded over 35 years, it would be impossible for the Turners to prove their innocence by pointing to someone else's DNA. At a March 2024 hearing, prosecutors were blindsided. One prosecutor even admitted, "This is pretty explosive evidence." The judge, Circuit Judge Roger Young Sr., agreed that such a significant alternative suspect theory warranted careful examination. He postponed any immediate ruling and gave both sides time to investigate the Evenitz connection. Prosecutors pushed back, of course. They argued that the Evenitz theory was speculative at best and a desperate defense tactic at worst. They pointed out that Evenitz's known crimes involved abducting girls from public places, assaulting them elsewhere, and disposing of their bodies in remote locations. That didn't match Justin's case at all. Justin was killed in or near his home and hidden on his own property. Moreover, there was no evidence placing Evenitz in Moncks Corner on March 3, 1989. Just being stationed in Charleston didn't mean he had opportunity. The Navy would have records of his duty schedule, his whereabouts, his movements. But digging through 35-year-old military records wasn't something that could be done overnight. The defense also seized on inconsistencies in the prosecution's theory about the murder weapon. Initially, prosecutors said it was a dog leash. Then experts suggested maybe a dog collar was involved too. The defense argued this showed the state was changing its theory on the fly and that crucial evidence, like the collar, was no longer available for examination due to the passage of time. In a particularly macabre detail, investigators had even exhumed the Turner family's long-deceased dog to check if the collar had been buried with the pet. They found nothing. The collar, if it ever existed, was gone. And the defense argued that its absence meant the Turners couldn't properly defend themselves against the allegation that it was the murder weapon. As spring turned to summer in 2024, both sides prepared their arguments for the big hearing. Justin's family attended every court date, wearing their buttons, standing in silent vigil for the little boy who couldn't speak for himself. They were hopeful, cautiously, painfully hopeful. Then came June 7, 2024. Judge Roger Young issued his ruling on the defense's motion to dismiss. And it was a ruling that shattered what little hope Justin's family had left. The judge granted the motion. He threw out the murder charges against Victor and Megan Turner. The reasoning was detailed and legally sound, even if it was emotionally devastating. Judge Young ruled that prosecuting the case 35 years after the crime would violate the defendant's rights to a fair trial. First, he noted that the prosecution hadn't actually presented truly new evidence, only new interpretations of existing evidence. The fiber analysis from 2021 was impressive, sure, but it was based on fibers and items that had been collected in 1989. Theoretically, that analysis could have been done back then if the technology existed. Using a better microscope decades later wasn't the same as discovering a brand new piece of evidence. Second, and more importantly, Judge Young emphasized the devastating loss of witnesses. More than 20 key witnesses were dead or unavailable. These included people who could have testified about the initial search, about statements the Turners allegedly made, about the condition of the crime scene. Without those witnesses available for cross-examination, the defense was severely hampered. The judge pointed out that trials rely on confrontation, the ability of the defense to question and challenge witnesses. When witnesses are dead, when their testimony exists only in written form from 35 years ago, that fundamental right is compromised. He also noted investigative missteps from 1989. The original investigation had been flawed in various ways. The crime scene wasn't secured as well as it should have been. Evidence preservation was less rigorous than modern standards. Inconsistencies in witness accounts were never properly resolved. In 2024, those flaws couldn't be corrected. The damage was done, and it was irreversible. Judge Young emphasized that the delay in charging Victor was particularly problematic. If prosecutors suspected him back in 1989, and they clearly had, given his failed polygraph and suspicious behavior, why wait 35 years to charge him? That delay caused actual prejudice to his ability to mount a defense. And then Judge Young did something that's relatively rare in criminal cases. He dismissed the charges with prejudice. That means the case is closed permanently. Prosecutors cannot refile charges. Victor and Megan Turner cannot be prosecuted for Justin's murder ever again, even if brand new evidence emerges. The judge reasoned that it would be impossible to have a fair trial under any circumstances now. So continuing to leave the Turners under the threat of future prosecution would be unjust. Better to close the door entirely. Legally, it made sense. Emotionally, it was devastating. The reaction was swift and polarized. Victor and Megan Turner, for the first time in 35 years, spoke publicly about the case. "It's been a living hell," Megan said. She talked about how she'd changed her name, how she'd lived in fear of being recognized, how she'd always felt the investigation was biased against her from the start. "Everything went so wrong with the investigation," she told reporters. "If we said anything, they tried to turn it against us." Victor echoed her sentiments, adding, "All I wanted was to get the person who did this." He claimed that by focusing exclusively on him and Megan, law enforcement had failed to investigate other leads. "We really won't ever know too much about what happened," he said, suggesting the real killer was still out there, unknown and unpunished. Justin's family had a very different reaction. In a statement released through the prosecutor's office, they wrote, "Today, our justice system failed an innocent 5-year-old boy." They thanked Sheriff Lewis and his cold case team for their tireless work and expressed deep disappointment that legal technicalities had prevented a jury from hearing the evidence. Amy Parsons, Justin's cousin who'd fought so hard to reopen the case, was heartbroken but defiant. "My fight for Justin will never stop," she said. Even without a conviction, even without legal justice, she vowed to continue honoring Justin's memory and telling his story. Prosecutor Scarlett Wilson released a thoughtful statement acknowledging the painful reality of cold cases. "Mistakes that were made 35 years ago could not be remedied," she admitted. She praised Sheriff Lewis's commitment, but conceded that the judge's ruling was probably correct from a legal standpoint. Sometimes, justice cannot be obtained after so long, no matter how hard everyone works. Sheriff Dwayne Lewis expressed his disappointment, but also his respect for the court's decision. "This is not the outcome we were seeking. However, we understand the technicality of cases from years ago," he said. It was a gracious statement from someone who'd poured years of effort into solving this case, only to see it dismissed on procedural grounds. In the aftermath, Victor Turner struck a somewhat bitter tone. "Law enforcement failed us at the beginning," he told reporters. "A lot of bad people made a lot of bad decisions, making it hard for the good people. I think they failed us." It was a stunning reversal. The man suspected by many of killing his own son was now blaming police for not finding the real killer. Today, more than 35 years after Justin Lee Turner's death, the case remains officially unsolved. They believe Victor and Megan Turner got away with murder. The legal system, bound by rules about fair trials and due process, couldn't deliver the justice that Justin's family desperately wanted. Whether that's a failure of the system or a protection of constitutional rights depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is that a beautiful little boy lost his life in a horrific way, and his family has lived with that pain for over 3 decades. Justin would be 40 years old now if he'd lived. He'd have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, maybe had a career and a family of his own. Instead, he's forever frozen in time as that smiling 5-year-old with blonde hair and blue eyes in his kindergarten photo. Justin is buried in Somerville Cemetery in Dorchester County, South Carolina, not far from where his mother Elaine was later laid to rest. His grave still receives visitors, family members who've never forgotten him, and even strangers who know his story and want to pay their respects. His childhood friend, Justin Smith, the boy who waited for him at the bus stop that Friday morning, carries a tattoo of Justin Turner's face on his calf, a permanent reminder of the friend he lost and the innocence that died that day in rural South Carolina. In a sense, the final justice for Justin Turner may not be legal at all. It may be the fact that his story hasn't been forgotten, that people still care, that his family still fights for him, still speaks his name, still refuses to let the world move on as if he never mattered. Justin Lee Turner deserved so much more from life. He deserved to grow up. He deserved safety, love, and protection. And yes, he deserved justice. Whether he got it, or ever will, is a question that may never be answered.